We're going to do an AP Calc AB problem here. We're going to just do part D for this video here. And it's asking, looking at this functions f and g, which are differentiable for all real numbers, which is important, and g is strictly increasing, etc., all that information. It says if g inverse is the inverse of the function g, write an equation for the line tangent to the graph of g inverse of x at the point x equals 2. So we need to find, first of all, we need to find a point on g inverse of x. Specifically, we need to find g inverse of 2. Okay, and then we need to also find, so that's the first step, and then we have to find the slope at that point. The slope at 2. The slope of g inverse of 2 at x equals 2. Okay, and then we can use the point slope form, which is of course y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1 from all the way back in algebra 1. So how do we do these things? Well, first let's find the point. And I'll do this, continue to do this in red. Let's find the point first. And so the point that we're looking for is, we're looking for where when g, it says when x equals 2 and it's on g inverse. So if you remember the relationship of g, if you have g of, if you have the point, let's say that the point, for example, 3 comma 4. 3 comma 4 is a point on g of x, meaning g of 3 equals 4. Then g inverse of 4 would equal 3. You flip the 2 around. In other words, g inverse, a point on g inverse would be 4 comma 3. You see how those are flipped? That's what it means to be an inverse. You flip the x's and the y's around. Okay, so that's the thought that I'm going after right here. So let's look back at what this is asking us in the problem. It's saying, write the equation of the line tangent to the graph of g inverse of x at x equals 2. Well, if x equals 2, if x equals 2 on g inverse, that's like saying there's my x value, then that means that g of x equals that value. And in my example up here, I'm using the 0.34, but in this case, it's using the 0.2. 2 is the x value, which means g of x equals 2.
Okay.
In other words, if I look back up at this problem now, at this graph, I see I'm looking for where g of x equals 2, and here's my g of x right here, my g of x values, and where does that equal 2? When x equals 1, g of x equals 2. So let's now replace these things now that we see our specific answer. So I'm going to erase all these values so you see why I was randomly picking 4 and 3 just to show you points, but now let's find the exact one. So when on g of x our point is 1 comma 2, that means that g of 1 equals 2. Our inverse function will be 2 comma 1. Our point on our inverse will be 2 comma 1, so when I plug in 2, I get 1, in other words. Okay, so there's my point. My point is 2 comma 1. The point that I'm looking for is 2 comma 1. So I got part of my stuff filled in. Y minus 1 equals x minus 2. Now I only have to find my slope, and I'll be done. So what's the slope? Well, this is where we come up with a formula. And the formula for a slope of an inverse, the derivative of an inverse function is equal to 1 over the derivative of the function with the inverse plugged into it. That's your formula. And it comes actually from the chain rule. I'll show you that real quick. So we know that if I take a function and I compose it with its inverse, I'm going to always get x. Because they're inverses, that's one of the definitions. They kind of delete each other, they undo each other, and I just get x right back out. Okay? So let's take the derivative of this function. Let's take the derivative of this equation on both sides with respect to x. If I take the derivative of both sides, on my right side I just get 1. And on my left side I'm going to have to do the chain rule. So the derivative of that with respect to x is going to be the derivative of g with the inside unchanged times the derivative of the inside. Well, this is where it gets hard to even write it. A lot of times you'll see people write it with, they'll just redefine it, but I'm trying to keep it all in one. So it's the derivative. Okay. So if I want to solve this for, notice what I have here is what I want to solve for. What's the derivative of an inverse of a function? It's equal to, I'm dividing by this thing now, it's equal to 1 over the derivative of the function, original function, composed with the inverse on the inside of it. So that's the proof for it, if that makes sense. So there it is written out right there. So let's see if we can use this. Well, do we know the inverse, g inverse of, what's my x again? What's my x going to be in this case? For what value am I looking? I'm looking for 2. So this, which is my slope, right, which is the m, is equal to 1 over, well, I got to start on the inside. What's g inverse of 2?
1.
G inverse of 2 is 1. So what's g prime of 1? Go up here to your formula. What's g prime of 1?
5.
It's 5. So 1/5 is your slope. So that's the long explanation for part D on this AP Calc problem.